All right, y'all, welcome back. This is going to be the final unit in the semester for Asian politics. This will be the India section, and I chose a different direction for this book. You know, we did a lot of sort of the basic history, basic structure, sort of textbook kind of approach for Eastern Asia. I kind of wanted to introduce sort of this is almost built like a thesis, so I thought it was a really sort of great introduction into what you might be looking at in sort of a law school slash graduate school um, kind of writing process, right? So it's very succinct, it's very research based, it's very well cited. It was published in 2024, which makes it very contemporaneous. So I only read the first chapter and I was like, okay, this is really interesting. So, that's why I guess the different approach on this one. But I kind of wanted to let you see what it looks like to write a master's thesis or that sort of thing. Okay, so we're only going to do the first three chapters. It's sort of an introspective criticism, I guess, of the Modi government. Modi was elected in 2014. He was reelected in 2019, pretty overwhelmingly. But then 2024, his coalition suffered some electoral consequences. They didn't lose, but they didn't win nearly as big as they thought they were going to be, right? And not nearly like 2019. And there are some growing problems in the Indian economy, including sort of agglomeration and oligarchy, you might call it. Um, High levels of joblessness and youth joblessness and black market economies, um, high ethnic tensions, right, between Muslim and Hindu generally, especially in sort of the northern areas, highly ethnically diverse from Tamils all the way in sort of the southeast to Nepalese up in the northeast to Muslims in the northwest near Pakistan. Still border problems with Pakistan and Bangladesh. Uh, sort of a lot of fighting and a lot of rhetoric between them and China, who also have a border and who had a bit of a border skirmish where a couple dozen soldiers died in early 2024, from what I remember. And so things aren't great, and their economy isn't. It, it's growing, but it's not helping the average person, right? And so this is a really interesting sort of um, it shows, I guess, the contradictions in policy and rhetoric in the sort of Modi government, the sort of newer nationalistic BJP, right? The Bharatiya Janata Party, and it's right now the largest party in India, um, the largest coalition party in India, at least. Congress Party used to dominate India under the Gandhis and um, Nehru and others, uh, but things have shifted toward a much more sort of neoliberal, um, cutting of red tape sort of thing, but also sort of a fierce Hindu nationalism, right, and an othering of anyone who doesn't believe in sort of the um, I guess the Hindu philosophy or the Hindu religion, whatever you might call it, especially Muslims. So, anyway, that's a little bit of an introduction. We'll dive in. Section one talks about the intro. Um, we should talk about the rising nationalism under Modi. This is a rising phenomenon in the world. This isn't just an India problem. This is arguably an America problem. This is a Germany problem. This is a France problem. This is man, all over the world, you're seeing rising nationalism, right? With Duterte, with Bolsonaro in Brazil, um, all across sort of North America, right? With the United States and arguably with Mexico. So yeah, this is a rising problem. Um, in India, this coalition of the BJP, again the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is run by Modi at the moment, basically, um, has sort of tied itself interestingly with the big business class, right? and that's its biggest like donor. But it's also used this sort of Indian Hindu nationalism uh, to rile up the sort of lower and middle classes too, right? And we'll talk about some of the other things that the Modi government does with like individualized welfare projects instead of sort of state-run infrastructure and investment in things like schools, etc. Um, and generally, this is an they use an othering of Muslims and others, but especially Muslims, to sort of rile people up, right? And so what we've seen in the last, I would argue that this has probably always existed in India, this sort of bovine vigilantism, but it's become largely the state has acquiesced to this. They sort of turn a blind eye, right? So it's a lot like sort of the former Democratic Party in the Jim Crow South, right? The Democrats owned all of the governments, the government institutions in the South, the state government, the local police, local judiciary, local judges, whatever. And so, roving bands of white supremacists using fear tactics in the South, like the KKK and others, were largely a blind eye was turned right to their oppression and violence against blacks and others trying to vote. And so this sort of looks like that turning of the blind eye against violence that is instituted in the party's behalf, right? So, kind of a scary thing and a growing problem. Let's see. On the other hand, interestingly, like while they've been the rhetoric is about protection of bovine. Of course, the Brahmin is like a religious symbol in their society. And so they've been sort of pushing this Hindu nationalism and even like quietly pushing this vigilantism, right? But out of the other side of their when you look away from the rhetoric, right, and you look at the actual policies, India's beef industry is booming, right? It is a massive export industry. It's one of the biggest exporters in the world of beef and of buffalo, especially to markets like Vietnam, Philippines, China, etc. Right, um, and so this sort of contradiction is what they want to point out in this book, which is really interesting, right? The rhetoric is saying one thing while the state apparatus is doing another, and the sort of political economy shows a completely different direction, right? And this has included not only um, the sort of pushing of beef exports to bolster the Indian economy, but also the agglomeration of the export market by friendlies to the Modi regime, right? So yeah, it's sort of a fascinating thing. And so you could again point to a trend like in the United States with ranching and agriculture in general becoming far more uh, capitalized, right? Commercialized, I guess I would say. These huge tracts of land run by massive corporations. Like the small farmer doesn't really exist all that much more in America, despite I guess I don't know, the vision that people see in their head when they think of American farming. It's sort of like it's becoming that with ranching in India, where massive corporations sort of snatch up all the land and all of the cattle and control the export markets, the processing plants, etc. So, yeah, it's kind of an interesting phenomenon that's been changing. Um, arguably before Modi, but it's really been strengthened since 2014, 2015 under Modi. Let's see. I wanted to just point out the thesis because the thesis for the book, right, is sort of in this intro section, and that's something I've been trying to push to some of you is like let's build a strong intro with a real thesis, right, so that readers know where we're going. But this was the thesis specifically says We show how those groups among classes of labor in the countryside and cities across India, whose livelihoods are dependent upon the livestock economy, have in various ways experienced a quote double victimization, being at the receiving end of destructive Hindu nationalist cow vigilantism and legal crackdowns, as well as the losing end of an ongoing restructuring of the livestock economy that favors major actors backed and represented by dominant class interests, right? So this is the big piece, right? That there is a double victimization of the people who tend to be at the bottom end of the rung of the economic ladder in India, especially smallholders and small ranchers. Like we find out that the average rancher in India has two cows, right? Like that's not very much, obviously. Um, but that's changing, right? And they're being sort of driven out of the market by this big agglomeration. Okay, section two, bovine paradox, authoritarian populism, and state contradiction. So the book basically aims to shift away from just ideology and discourse toward a former researcher's paper called, or a theory called Henry Bernstein, who talks about the domain of the state, the capitalist dynamics, and class and interclass relationships. So we can't just look at the rhetoric and the sort of policy. We also have to look at, how this affects people, the different sort of cleavage structures in society, et cetera. Um, and she also mentioned that she based it on some of the work of the neo-communist theory named Gramsci, who I've actually cited before. He's an interesting writer, with some really interesting ways of sort of reflecting on how to research a topic or an area, right, based on sort of class cleavages. So, yeah, pretty interesting stuff. Section three is on state contradictions in Modi's India, neo-lib, and accumulation patterns. So we were talking a little bit about this in the intro. The shift toward neoliberalism really kicked off around 1991, right? Because from 1958, which, from what I remember, is India's independence from the British colonial system. 1958, India breaks away, and they kick in a state model of um, sort of light communism, I guess. Uh, Socialism. These terms are so crunchy, but they were far more redistributive, welfare based, than the BJP, right? And so this model was instituted from the late 50s until around 1991. The 80s, as many know, had some troubling times with debt and finance and inflation rates, currency collapses, right? And so India also had to move in sort of a new direction. So they take a step toward neoliberalism in 1991. They're one of the few who actually weren't in dire straits, right? Like they didn't need to go to the IMF for emergency loans. They didn't really. They didn't have to institute like really strict neoliberalism or in Europe, what do they call it? Man, I can't remember. Anyway, so it was sort of a lighter version of neoliberalism, right? Like they're moving away from sort of the socialist pattern, the statist pattern, toward a more neoliberal model. They want to reduce, red tape. They want to sort of introduce privatization of industries, small businesses, things like this. Okay, and it was also a big construction boom for India at the time. And so this sort of light neoliberalism goes on from 1991 until around 2014 when Modi is elected, and Modi sort of the BJP overturns the former. It's not even the Congress Party; it's more of like a coalition with the Congress Party. Um, but neoliberalism, as we know from literature across the world, basically research across the planet, it can do great things for the economy, right? You generally see growth. You generally see investment in infrastructure. You see higher exports and trade, but you also see high inequality, right? As some get wealthy or hyper wealthy, while others are sort of left behind because of the structural changes in the economy, right? And so we see this in a lot of places. South Korea, Japan, the United States, where moves towards sort of really high levels of neoliberalism or hyper capitalism, whatever you want to call it, can lead to some real plutarchy situations, kind of, where you get high rents being paid by those at the bottom to those at the top just because they have such a stronghold over whatever it might be, a sector of the economy, the money to bully people around in the sort of legal system, um, monopoly or monopsony kind of powers, these sorts of problems, right? Um, and inequality now is arguably at its highest point since 1958, really. There are a lot of people being left behind who are without homes, without land. There are really high rates of suicide in rural regions in India. So yeah, there are problems. Like they're growing and they're becoming sort of a second level economy in the world, right? But they need to make some real changes, I think, if they're going to bring everyone along. I guess it has gotten to the point where 98, say 100 Indians basically own 40%, not 40%, the same amount as the bottom 40% of the country, right? So 100 people own the same as the 550 million poorest Indians. So it kind of gives you an example of the inequality I'm talking about. Neoliberal reforms promised growth, yeah, and reductions in inequality, which was problematic, and rising mobility. Um, we could argue that growth has increased. There might be some boosts in mobility as their college systems get better, as some of their private urban high school systems, et cetera, get better. But for the most part, mobility has not increased and maybe has gotten worse for the majority of Indians. And they have not really seen, they've seen an explosion of inequality rather than a reduction in inequality, right? And growth is not great, right? For such a big growing economy, you can often see 8 to 10% growth rates, and India's not really anywhere near there. They're still struggling with things like the state being able to control like um, adulterated products, right? Like the U.S. pharmaceutical industry gets a lot of drugs from India, but we have found real problems in their supply chains that have caused deaths and things like this. So there are problems that also need to be fixed pretty dramatically in India. From 2004 to 2014, the Congress Party and the United Progressive Alliance kind of had a coalition together, right? And they sort of continued their neoliberal policies, but they also tried to implement sort of mass welfare programs, including food, education, and things like this. This caused problems, though, with the spending, right? Because there are certain sectors of the Indian economy that see that sort of thing as welfare or communism or whatever, right? And there are those in every country in the world that see things that way, right? You're not going to be able to avoid that, and you're not going to be able to avoid the other side, the left, right? So um, this did cause frustration amongst the sort of upper middle class and the upper classes, and it caused them to turn toward Modi very strongly with their donation money. They sort of voting with their money, right, to push back against all these welfare programs. And so Modi shifted away from the sort of Congress Party secular socialist approach, much more towards sort of Hindu nationalism, right? Um, and and so he arguably implemented these really harsh neoliberal reforms in India to get donation dollars, but then also whipped up nationalist sentiment against Muslims and other groups to get a strong voter base, right, among Hindus. Okay, like we were talking about, the neoliberal policies has allowed for a lot of extreme wealth accumulation for a very small number of not only individuals but also corporate entities, right? So some research from 2023 shows that 20 companies generate about 80% of India's production and economy, like 20%, right? And that's up from 20 companies. And that's up from 70% in 2019, 40% before Modi, and only 14% in 1989, right? So there was a very competitive um, economy, at least. It was much less sort of monopolized or oligopolized, however you want to refer to, right? And this sort of accumulation and agglomeration is increasing under the Modi government. And this is also, I mean, arguably what we're seeing in the United States over the past 30 or so years, right? And maybe even before that. Let's see, unemployment is growing in India, especially among the youth. It's very, very high among youth. There are growing levels of hunger and poverty, right? A lot of studies are showing that hunger is spreading, poverty and extreme poverty are spreading. And this has long term effects on education, on whether a kid even goes to school or whether they have to sort of eke out a living in the black market or whatever. Um, Malnourishment can have extreme problems later in life, right? With mental productivity, business productivity, economic productivity, etc. So these long-term effects of like malnourishment and starvation and the inability to get into schooling, etc., can really have long-term problems in the future. So that's something that India is going to have to keep an eye out. And we also know that extremely high youth unemployment can cause violence in society, right? So we see it. We saw it, post 2009 in some of the southern Euro countries. We see it in the Central American corridor. Um, we see it in China oftentimes because of their one child policy. There's so many young men who cannot find either a job or a mate and sort of lash out against society. So, these can be really problematic as well. Um, let's see. I would also point out that Modi's welfare programs have been largely very like particularized to the individual, not the society, right? And so they will literally send digital welfare on a card, like a lot of Latin American countries have implemented in the last 20 or 30 years. They'll offer free fuel. They'll offer medical insurance. But one of the problems with this is that some economists, etc., argue that that kind of money should be spent on big society-wide projects, right? Like improvements in schooling, improvements in infrastructure, um, so that everyone sort of gains the benefits, right? Rather than being highly particularized, which can often leave people still um, in precarious positions, right? It does help, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it can cause issues with slippery slope, these sorts of things. So others have argued that there should be larger infrastructure projects in place, I guess is what I'm saying. Okay, thank you so much. I'll get the other two up here shortly and have a wonderful day.